Now that we finished the lower back portion, we're going to do the center portion of the back. This part is gathered to the lower portion, okay? So the middle of it is gathered to that lower portion of our blouse back, okay? So you see we have 3 notches here. The outside notches are where the gathers begin, all right? And we want to start the gathering. I'm marking the 2 outside notches, and you also have a center back notch that's in the center, which I'll mark as well. Okay, so these 2 outside notches, we're going to start our gathering an inch before the notch and end it an inch after the notch. Okay, before we do that, stay stitch your armholes on here, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And now that we're done stay stitching our armholes, we'll do our gathering stitches. Remember to start an inch before the outside notch. Leave long tails or threads so that you can pull them to gather them. And then just stitch. Remember, this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so do your first row gathering at a 1/2 inch. And this is just like the gathering sample we did as well. Do a large stitch length so that you can gather. Okay. All right, that's my first row. And now I'll do my second row. And this row you do about 1/8 of an inch away. Use the toe of your presser foot to kind of gauge or use as a mark that you can sew off of. All right, now we have our gathering stitches. Now we need to pin our lower back panel, matching up our center back notches to our center back panel. Okay, so put right sides together, line up the notches, and then bring those outside notches, because your lower back panel has darts on it. Those outside notches where the gathering began will line up with your darts. Okay, so again, the notches on the center back panel with the gathering, the outside notches, line up with the darts on the lower back panel. And then at side seam, they should just match. You should be able to pin them together. So start your center back and then pin out. And do that on both sides. And you'll see you'll have a lot of fabric in between the dart and center back, basically, on your upper back panel. All right, once you've pinned it, go ahead and you're going to be gathering each side separately. So grab your the long threads of your gathering stitches. Remember to pull them smaller than you need them, and then pull it to size to match the other one. Once you have it to the correct length, so that the upper and lower panel match, put a pin in at the end of your gathering stitches and anchor them in so that they don't come out and move on you. And now go ahead and take a pin and just spread those gathers out evenly. So they're being spread out evenly between the center back notch and the notch that lines up with your dart. So this is one side of the blouse back. And once you have them spread evenly, go ahead and just pin them in place. Again, this is just like our gathering demo. Make sure you put in enough pins so that those gathers don't move on you as you do the other side and as you sew it. And then do the other side the exact same way. All right, now you can go ahead, once you have everything pinned together and gathered, and stitch it at a 1/2 inch. Make sure you back tack at the beginning and at the end. Be careful stitching over your needle, your pins. Try to take them out as you go. If you're worried about your gathers moving too much, you can leave them in, but walk your needle over your pins. Don't just stitch over them. So it may take a little finagling as you go through. You might have to move gathers a little bit as you do it, but it should go in pretty nicely. And then just back tack at the end. All right. That looks good. All right. So here it is sewn together. You can see the gathers. They're all centered between the two darts. All right, so now we're going to trim this seam allowance back to 1/4 of an inch. Because what we'll do here is we're going to bias bind this seam to clean finish it. So that binding that you made at the beginning for the first video we did for this, you're going to want to get that now. And make sure it's long enough to stretch a little longer than the length of this seam. And take the cut edge. Notice that my gathering is facing up. You're going to line that up on the gathering side. Okay. I'm going to sew this with the bias binding. Okay. Cut edge of the bias binding is against the cut edge of the seam, and I'm stitching it on that same. Right now it's 1/4, but it was a 1/2 inch when I sewed the seam originally. So just stitch right on your original stitching. Okay. Don't stitch into the jacket or into the blouse. Either stitch, stay right on your stitching or err on the side of being in the seam allowance. Okay, I'm just lining up the cut edges of the blouse with the bias binding and then back tack at the end. And you cut off any extra. Alright. So again, that was the cut edge of the bias binding lined up with the cut edge of the blouse. Now what I'm doing is I'm pressing my bias binding down. This is almost like a Hong Kong finish, except we don't trim at the end and there's no raw edges hidden anywhere like on the Hong Kong. So I'm pressing this bias binding down. Be careful, okay? I'm just pressing right on the seam. I didn't touch any of my gathers. I don't want to press my gathers. We'll flatten them out. And then I'm folding it around to the back, okay? So that's the part of my bias binding that has a crease in it. Okay, and I'm folding it right here to my stitches. Okay. So now I'm pressing it this way. This makes it much easier to sew the second time. Now there's 2 ways we can finish this. You can do it by hand. You can do a hidden slip stitch, and you travel down the crease of the bias binding and catch the seam allowance of the blouse. Okay, you can do it that way. Or you can stitch it like we did like we do on the Hong Kong finish. And that's what I'll do here. Okay, so again, the side that I pressed under is against the feed dogs. And I'm going to put my needle down. You can stitch in the ditch, or you can stitch right next to the ditch on the bias binding, which I'm going to do. But you want to make sure you catch that bias binding. That's why doing it by hand might be a little easier. It might take a little longer, but it might be a little nicer and cleaner. But again, you can do it by machine like I'm doing now too. Alright, so I'm stitching through all layers and catching that binding, the other edge of it, just like we do on a Hong Kong finish. And back tack at the end. Okay, there it is done. The seam is nice and clean and finished. And that's what it looks like. Now it's important to use organza or lining, or if your fashion fabric is thin enough there, because it'll make it a thick seam.